John had always thought his life was simple. He woke up early, worked at a local mechanic shop, and spent his free time fishing by the lake. It was peaceful and ordinary, nothing ever out of the usual. But all that changed the day he received an invitation that would turn his life upside down. It came in the form of a strange, silver envelope, one that felt too cold to be made of paper. The message inside was even more bizarre. John Miller, you are invited to a meeting with the Calta family. You are expected to fulfill your duty. John stared at the message for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The Calta family. He had never heard of them. The name didn't mean anything to him. But as he ran his fingers across the strange letters, he felt an odd sensation, as though the invitation was important, maybe even dangerous. His mind raced. Could this be some kind of joke? Some rich people playing tricks? But no, this felt real, too real. The date and time were clearly written. There was no avoiding it. So John decided to go. His curiosity got the best of him. When he arrived at the meeting place, a massive building that looked like something from another world, he was greeted by towering guards dressed in dark armor. They did not speak, but their cold stares told John all he needed to know. They were not here to play games. They led him into a room where a long table sat, and at the far end, an older man with sharp, piercing eyes waited. Behind him stood a young woman who looked as if she didn't want to be there. The man at the table spoke first. "John Miller, we are pleased you accepted our invitation. Please, have a seat." Confused and slightly intimidated, John sat down across from the stranger. "I don't understand. Who are you people? And why am I here?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. "We are the Calta, a family of great importance. And you, John, are now part of our plans." He paused, watching John closely. "We are requesting your hand in marriage to our daughter." John blinked. "What? I don't even know her." The woman behind the man shifted uncomfortably, her expression showing a mixture of reluctance and resolve. She had bright green eyes, and her long silver hair shimmered under the light. She looked like she had been expecting this, but her gaze avoided John's. "This marriage is not a request," the man continued. "It is an order from our family. It is for the good of our people and yours." John's heart raced. His mind tried to grasp what was happening, but the words wouldn't make sense. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "I'm not marrying anyone." The man's smile faded. "You will marry her, John, or there will be consequences. Your earth is not as safe as you think." John felt the weight of those words settle on his chest. What had he gotten himself into? The woman behind him took a step forward. Her voice was soft but firm. "It's not your choice, John," she said quietly. "But I'll explain why this has to happen." The tension in the room thickened as John realized this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And the alien woman's eyes, cold yet somehow pleading, told him this was more than a simple arrangement. John couldn't stop thinking about the strange proposal. His mind kept replaying the conversation with the Calta family, especially the moment when the alien girl spoke. Her words were soft, almost as if she was not fully convinced by the situation herself. The next day, John was brought back to the Calta's mansion. This time, he wasn't alone. The alien girl, whose name he had learned was Lyra, was waiting for him. She stood near a large window, her silver hair glowing faintly under the sunlight. Her eyes, a deep shade of green, seemed to pierce through him as she noticed his arrival. John didn't know what to expect. Lyra was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about her. She was no ordinary person. She was an alien, and everything about her seemed to come from another world. Despite her grace and beauty, there was a coldness about her, a distance that made John feel like a stranger in her presence. "You're early," Lyra said in her calm, melodic voice, though there was a hint of something more, maybe curiosity. I didn't have much choice," John replied, feeling awkward. He shuffled his feet, unsure of what to say next. The last few days had been a blur, and he still didn't understand why this was happening to him. Lyra looked at him carefully, her gaze searching. "I didn't want this either," she confessed softly, her words surprising him. "But my family, they won't let me refuse." John raised an eyebrow. "You don't want to get married to me?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "No," she said firmly. "I don't even know you. How could I want to marry someone I don't know? But in my family, duty comes first." Her words confused John even more. He could see the sadness in her eyes, but there was also something else, something stronger. It was clear she wasn't completely helpless in this situation. Despite the pressure from her family, she was still in control in some ways. "Then why don't you just leave?" John asked, his voice a bit sharper than he intended. "If you don't want this, why stay?" Lyra's expression hardened. "It's not that simple. My family has power. If I refuse, they could destroy everything. And everyone I care about." John felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what kind of power the Calda family wielded, but he could tell it was immense. "So, you're trapped," he said quietly, understanding her situation a little better. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I'm not the only one who's trapped. You are too. This marriage, it's not just for me. It's for my family. It's for power, for control, and for a future neither of us can escape." John stood there, trying to process everything. This wasn't just about him anymore. Lyra wasn't just some alien girl being forced into a marriage. She was someone who had been caught in the same web of power and politics that had ensnared him. And yet, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that she was still holding something back. "What else are you not telling me, Lyra?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She met his gaze, her eyes holding a mixture of fear and resolve. "You don't want to know, but maybe, just maybe, you'll find out soon enough." And with that, she turned away, leaving John standing there with more questions than answers. One thing was clear. This was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Days passed, and John found himself caught in a whirlwind of confusion, tension, and strange traditions. The Calda family was preparing for the ceremony, and John was expected to be there, to take part in something he didn't understand. Every day, more rules, rituals, and customs were thrown his way. At first, he tried to push back, to make sense of everything, but it felt like no matter what he did, he was always one step behind. Lyra didn't make it any easier. Every time John tried to talk to her, she was distant, her emotions hidden behind a wall. Sometimes she would glance at him, almost as if she wanted to say something, but then she'd look away and go back to her duties. It was as though she was stuck in her own world, trapped by her family's expectations. But John couldn't ignore her. There was something about her, the way she carried herself, the sadness in her eyes, the way she seemed to long for something more. The more he saw her, the more he realized that this wasn't just a simple arranged marriage. It was a symbol of something much bigger, something dangerous. The day before the ceremony, John was called into a large hall. It was dark, the air thick with the scent of strange incense, and the walls were lined with alien symbols he couldn't understand. The Calta family was waiting for him, standing in their ceremonial robes, their expressions serious and unreadable. "We are honored that you have accepted your role in this union," the family patriarch said, his voice echoing in the cold room. His eyes gleamed, almost like he knew something John didn't. "Tomorrow, you will marry our daughter, Lyra, and together, you will seal the future of our two worlds." John's heart raced. He didn't want this, didn't even understand it. But there was no way out. Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "You're trapped just like me." It felt like he was sinking deeper into a pit he couldn't climb out of. "You will wear the garb of our people," the patriarch continued, motioning to a set of strange robes laid out before him. "You will follow our traditions, and you will become part of our family." John nodded, though his mind was still in turmoil. What was he really agreeing to? Was this just a marriage, or was it the beginning of something much larger? As the family began explaining the final preparations, John's thoughts turned to Lyra. She hadn't been in the room yet, and he found himself wondering what she was doing. Was she as nervous as he was? Was she as unwilling to go through with this as he was? He couldn't help but look for her, even in this strange place filled with unfamiliar customs. And just as he turned his head, he caught sight of her standing at the doorway. Her silver hair shimmered in the dim light, and her eyes, once cold, now held something else, something almost like fear. Lyra stepped forward slowly, her gaze meeting John's for a brief moment before she turned to face her family. Her expression was unreadable, but John could see the tension in her posture. She was nervous. She was afraid. And somehow, in that moment, it became clear that they weren't so different after all. The patriarch turned his attention to her. Lyra, come. We will begin the final preparations for tomorrow. Lyra gave John one last glance before she walked away, disappearing into the shadows. John was left standing in the cold, dark room, more unsure than ever about what was coming next. The night before the ceremony, John couldn't sleep. His mind was too full of questions and doubts. The mansion felt quiet, too quiet, and the weight of everything that was happening pressed down on him like a heavy stone. The strange customs, the alien rituals, and the cold, distant family, all of it felt wrong. But what could he do? His choices had been stripped away the moment he entered the Calta family's world. He sat by a window, staring out into the dark. The stars above Earth had never seemed so distant, so far from the reality he was trapped in. He thought about his life before all this. It was simple, comfortable. But now, everything had changed. He wasn't just about to marry an alien girl. He was becoming a pawn in a much larger game. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, startled, and saw Lyra standing in the doorway. Her expression was serious, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't here just to follow orders. She was here for something else. "I need to talk to you," Lyra said softly, stepping into the room. John stood up quickly, unsure of what to say. "What's going on, Lyra? Why didn't you tell me everything? Why didn't you explain?" "I couldn't," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "There's too much at stake. You don't understand the whole picture." John felt his frustration grow. "Then make me understand. All this time, I've been in the dark. You keep saying things like, 'This marriage isn't just a marriage,' but you won't tell me what it really means." Lyra looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "You're right. I've kept things from you, but I can't keep doing that." She took a deep breath and met his eyes. "This marriage, it's not just about us. It's about power. The Calta family controls a vast empire. My father, he wants me to marry you not just because it's tradition, but because you're human. He believes that humans will be key to an alliance that will give us an edge over our enemies." John's mind raced as he processed her words. "So this isn't about us. It's about politics. Power." "Yes," Lyra said softly. "And there's more. My father is planning something big, something dangerous. If this alliance works, it will shift the balance of power in the galaxy. But if it fails, it could spark a war. And my family will do anything to make sure it succeeds." John's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a forced marriage. It was a high-stakes political move that could affect the future of entire civilizations. "But what about you?" John asked quietly. "What do you want, Lyra? Are you just going to go along with this?" Lyra's eyes softened, and for the first time, John saw the pain in her. "I don't want any of this. I never asked for it, but I don't have a choice. If I refuse, my family will make sure I regret it. I'm trapped." John felt a wave of sympathy for her. He had his own reasons for feeling trapped, but hearing her story made him realize how much more complicated things were for her. She wasn't just being forced into a marriage. She was being used as a pawn in a game she didn't want to play. "I'll help you," John said suddenly. We can figure this out together. We don't have to just accept it." Lyra looked at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. She took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, John," she said, her eyes filled with emotion. "But we're running out of time. Tomorrow, it begins, and I don't know what's going to happen next." As she turned and left the room, John felt the weight of the situation settle even heavier on his shoulders. The next day would change everything. But now, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. Lyra had shared her burden, and together, they might just find a way out of this impossible situation. The morning of the ceremony arrived far too soon. John stood in front of the large mirror in his room, staring at the strange robes he was supposed to wear. They were nothing like the clothes he was used to, ornate, alien, and uncomfortable. The dark colors and patterns on the fabric felt foreign, as though they didn't belong in his world. But there was no turning back now. His mind was still spinning from everything Lyra had revealed the night before, her family's plans, their power, the looming threat of war. It was all so much to process. And now he was supposed to walk into a marriage that wasn't even his choice. It wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about power, politics, and the future of both human and Kelta civilizations. But as John prepared for the ceremony, something inside him shifted. He couldn't go through with it. Not like this. He couldn't just stand by and let Lyra be used as a pawn. He had to do something. Lyra's face flashed in his mind. She had seemed so defeated, so lost in her family's world. But now, John knew there was more to her. There was strength beneath that calm exterior, a fire she had been holding back. If they were going to change anything, they would have to fight. Together. John didn't have much time. He knew the ceremony would begin soon, but he had a plan. If he could get to Lyra before the Kelta family had a chance to force her into the Union, maybe, just maybe, they could escape. He slipped out of his room quietly, trying not to attract attention. The mansion was eerily silent, the tension in the air thick, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The deeper he went into the building, the more he felt the weight of what was about to occur. He could hear distant voices, the sound of preparation, but none of it made him hesitate. At last, he found Lyra in a secluded room, away from the rest of the Kelta family. She was standing by a window, looking out at the distant stars, her face unreadable. "Lyra," John called softly, stepping into the room. She turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "John, what are you doing here?" "The ceremony. It's almost time." "I can't do this," John said, shaking his head. "I can't go through with it. And neither can you." Lyra's expression shifted, her face hardening. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about my family, about everything they've worked for. If we don't do this, we can't just let them control us." John interrupted, his voice firm. "You're not a pawn. I'm not a pawn. I won't let this happen." Lyra's eyes softened, her resolve beginning to waver. "But what choice do we have? They will destroy everything, everything we know, if we refuse." John stepped closer, his heart racing. "We have a choice. We have to fight. Together." For a moment, there was silence. Lyra's gaze flickered between him and the door, as though she were weighing the risks. But then, slowly, she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "I've been too afraid to fight. But maybe it's time we both took a stand." John reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll find a way out of this. I promise you, Lyra. Together, we can make it through." Lyra squeezed his hand, her expression turning from fear to determination. "Then let's go." They turned toward the door, their plans set in motion. The ceremony would begin soon, but now they had a new goal. It wasn't just about surviving the Kelta family's control, it was about fighting for freedom, for both of them. As they stepped out of the room, John felt the weight of the decision settle over him. There was no turning back now. The rebellion had begun. The morning of the ceremony arrived far too soon. John stood in front of the large mirror in his room, staring at the strange robes he was supposed to wear. They were nothing like the clothes he was used to, ornate, alien, and uncomfortable. The dark colors and patterns on the fabric felt foreign, as though they didn't belong in his world. But there was no turning back now. His mind was still spinning from everything Lyra had revealed the night before, her family's plans, their power, the looming threat of war. It was all so much to process. And now he was supposed to walk into a marriage that wasn't even his choice. It wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about power, politics, and the future of both human and Kelta civilizations. But as John prepared for the ceremony, something inside him shifted. He couldn't go through with it. Not like this. He couldn't just stand by and let Lyra be used as a pawn. He had to do something. Lyra's face flashed in his mind. She had seemed so defeated, so lost in her family's world. But now, John knew there was more to her. There was strength beneath that calm exterior, a fire she had been holding back. If they were going to change anything, they would have to fight. Together. John didn't have much time. He knew the ceremony would begin soon, but he had a plan. If he could get to Lyra before the Kelta family had a chance to force her into the Union, maybe, just maybe, they could escape. He slipped out of his room quietly, trying not to attract attention. The mansion was eerily silent, the tension in the air thick, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The deeper he went into the building, the more he felt the weight of what was about to occur. He could hear distant voices, the sound of preparation, but none of it made him hesitate. At last, he found Lyra in a secluded room, away from the rest of the Kelta family. She was standing by a window, looking out at the distant stars, her face unreadable. "Lyra," John called softly, stepping into the room. She turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "John, what are you doing here?" "The ceremony. It's almost time." "I can't do this," John said, shaking his head. "I can't go through with it. And neither can you." Lyra's expression shifted, her face hardening. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about my family, about everything they've worked for. If we don't do this, we can't just let them control us." John interrupted, his voice firm. "You're not a pawn. I'm not a pawn. I won't let this happen." Lyra's eyes softened, her resolve beginning to waver. "But what choice do we have? They will destroy everything we know, if we refuse." John stepped closer, his heart racing. "We have a choice. We have to fight. Together." For a moment, there was silence. Lyra's gaze flickered between him and the door, as though she were weighing the risks. But then, slowly, she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "I've been too afraid to fight. But maybe it's time we both took a stand." John reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll find a way out of this. I promise you, Lyra. Together, we can make it through." Lyra squeezed his hand, her expression turning from fear to determination. "Then let's go." They turned toward the door, their plans set in motion. The ceremony would begin soon, but now they had a new goal. It wasn't just about surviving the Kelta family's control, it was about fighting for freedom, for both of them. As they stepped out of the room, John felt the weight of the decision settle over him. There was no turning back now. The rebellion had begun. John and Lyra moved quickly through the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the cold stone floors. The weight of their decision pressed down on them, but there was no turning back. They had made their choice, and now they had to follow through. Every corner, every shadow seemed to watch them as they passed. The mansion felt like a maze, dark, quiet, and full of secrets. They knew they didn't have much time. The ceremony was supposed to start soon, and the Kelta family would not be pleased if they were delayed. But John couldn't help feeling like they were being hunted. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each step. The Kelta family's power was vast, and John had no idea how far they would go to keep their plans intact. But one thing was clear. They would stop at nothing to make sure this marriage happened. "We need to get to the ship," Lyra whispered, her voice urgent. "It's the only way out. Once we're off-planet, they can't touch us." John nodded, gripping her hand tighter. "We'll make it. I won't let them stop us." They reached a hallway that led to the back of the mansion, where a hidden elevator would take them to the private docking bay. Lyra's family had a ship ready for the ceremony, and it was their only chance to escape. But as they approached the elevator, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. "Hide," Lyra hissed, pulling John behind a large pillar. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, holding their breath as a group of Calta soldiers passed by. Their armor gleamed in the dim light, their eyes scanning the halls as if they were looking for something or someone. John's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the soldiers talking in low voices, their language unfamiliar and harsh. They were searching for something, but they hadn't noticed them yet. Lyra turned to him, her face pale but determined. "We can't wait any longer. If they find us, we're done. We have to move now." John nodded again, his mind racing. They had to make it to the ship. There was no other option. But as they started to move again, the elevator doors suddenly opened, revealing an unexpected sight. Standing inside the elevator was the patriarch of the Calta family. His eyes locked onto John and Lyra, a cold smile forming on his lips. "So this is how it ends," he said, his voice full of amusement. "I should have known you two would try to escape. Did you really think you could hide from us?" John's stomach dropped. He had hoped to avoid confrontation, but now they were cornered. "You've made a grave mistake," the patriarch continued, his tone darkening. "This rebellion will not go unpunished. You both will learn that there are consequences for defying the Calta family." Lyra stepped forward, her voice trembling with fear, but there was a fire in her eyes. "You won't control us anymore. You forced me into this marriage, forced John into this life he didn't want. I refuse to be your puppet." The patriarch's smile faded, replaced with a look of cold fury. "Then you both will pay the price." Before John could react, the patriarch raised his hand, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway as more soldiers appeared from the shadows. They were trapped. "Run," Lyra shouted, pulling John by the arm as they dashed toward the back exit. The soldiers were closing in, and the patriarch's voice rang out behind them. "Do not think you can escape. No one crosses the Calta family and lives." But John and Lyra didn't stop. The rebellion had only just begun, and now there was no turning back. The sound of the Calta soldiers' heavy footsteps echoed through the hall as John and Lyra ran. Their breaths came in quick gasps, and John's heart pounded in his chest. The soldiers were fast, relentless, and they weren't going to stop until they had captured them. The patriarch's warning still rang in his mind. No one crosses the Calta family and lives. They darted through the narrow corridors, their footsteps almost lost in the deep shadows. John's mind raced. He knew they couldn't outrun the soldiers forever. There had to be another way out, another escape plan. But in the chaos of the moment, everything seemed unclear. All he knew for sure was that they couldn't be caught. They had to keep moving. "Where's the ship?" John panted, glancing at Lyra. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Just ahead," Lyra replied through clenched teeth, her voice tight with fear. "But we have to get past the guards first." They rounded a corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, they saw the dimly lit doors leading to the back exit. The docking bay. The ship, their only hope of freedom. But it was still too far, and the soldiers were gaining on them. John grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her into a side hallway. They needed to hide, to slow the soldiers down, or they'd never make it to the ship. The walls of the mansion were thick, the passageways twisting and turning in ways that only the Calta family knew. "There's a supply room up ahead," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can hide in there." They reached the small, windowless room, the air cool and filled with the scent of strange chemicals. John shut the door quietly behind them, his heart still racing. They crouched behind a stack of crates, listening as the soldiers' footsteps grew louder, closer. The sound of their voices, harsh and urgent, made John's stomach tighten. "They went this way," one of the soldiers growled. John held his breath, praying they wouldn't be found. He could hear the soldiers moving through the hall, checking each room, calling out for them. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Lyra's hand tightened in his, and for a moment, everything felt frozen. Time itself seemed to stop as they waited in silence. They could hear the soldiers just outside the door. "They're close," Lyra whispered, her voice full of dread. John nodded, his mind spinning. He needed a plan, and fast. He scanned the room, looking for anything that could help them escape. Then he noticed it, a ventilation shaft high up on the wall. It was small, but big enough for them to crawl through. "Can you climb?" John asked quietly, pointing to the shaft. Lyra looked up, her eyes sharp. "I think so." They had no time to lose. John found a crate to stand on, and Lyra climbed up to the vent, her movements quick and graceful. She pulled the cover off, revealing the dark passageway inside. "Go," John urged, his heart in his throat. "I'll follow." Lyra hesitated for a moment, looking back at him, but there was no time to argue. She crawled into the shaft, disappearing into the darkness. John quickly followed, squeezing into the narrow space behind her. The ventilation shaft was tight and uncomfortable, but it was their only chance. They crawled as quickly as they could, the sound of their movements echoing faintly through the metal walls. They had to move fast before the soldiers discovered their hiding spot. Behind them, John could hear the soldiers getting closer. But in that moment, as Lyra led the way, he felt a surge of hope. They weren't trapped anymore. They had a way out. If they could make it to the ship, they could escape this nightmare. But their journey was far from over. They had to survive the chase first. John and Lyra crawled through the narrow ventilation shaft, the metal walls pressing in around them. It wasn't comfortable, and the air was thick and stale, but it was their only chance. They had no idea how far they were from the docking bay, but they couldn't stop now. Every second they wasted could bring the soldiers closer. "I think we're almost there," Lyra whispered ahead, her voice muffled by the tight space. John could barely see her in the darkness, but he trusted her instincts. They had to be getting close. His heart was pounding, adrenaline still rushing through his veins. He had never imagined his life would come to this, running through an alien mansion, hiding from an entire family that could destroy him without a second thought. And yet, here they were. "How much further?" John asked, trying to control the panic in his voice. "Not much," Lyra replied, her tone steady but strained. "Just a little longer." The sound of distant voices filtered through the walls. The soldiers were still searching, and John could feel the pressure building. They couldn't afford to get caught now. Suddenly, they reached the end of the shaft. Lyra pushed against the vent cover, and it creaked open with a soft noise. She peered out, checking the area. "It's clear," she whispered. "Let's move." John followed her out into a narrow corridor, his feet finally on solid ground again. He could feel his legs trembling from the crawl through the shaft. But they couldn't stop. The ship was still ahead, still waiting for them, and if they could make it there, they could escape the Calta family's grasp. They moved quickly, staying low and avoiding the main halls where they might be spotted. The mansion was quiet now, except for the distant sounds of searching soldiers. John's stomach tightened with every step, but Lyra's calm determination helped him stay focused. She was leading the way, and he trusted her. As they neared the docking bay, they heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. John froze, his heart skipping a beat. They couldn't be caught now. They were so close. Lyra quickly pulled him to the side, pushing him behind a large storage crate. They crouched, holding their breath, as footsteps echoed nearby. The soldiers were getting closer, but they were still a few rooms away. The tension was unbearable. John's thoughts raced. He couldn't let them be caught. He couldn't let Lyra be caught. But as the footsteps grew louder, something inside him snapped. He couldn't just hide. He had to act. He had to protect both of them. "Lyra," John whispered urgently, "we can't keep running. We need to make a stand." Lyra looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about? We'll never get away if we fight them." "We don't have a choice," John said, his voice firm. "I'm not letting them control us anymore. We have to make it to the ship, and we have to make them pay for everything they've done." Lyra hesitated, but then she nodded. "You're right. We can't keep running forever." They both stood, moving quickly to the ship's entrance. As they stepped into the open space of the docking bay, they saw the Calta soldiers rushing toward them. The time for hiding was over. The time for action had come. John took a deep breath and stepped forward. "You won't stop us," he said, his voice full of resolve. Lyra stood beside him, her posture proud, despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "We're not your prisoners anymore." The soldiers stopped, staring at them in disbelief. They had underestimated these two humans, thinking they could be controlled without resistance. But now, John and Lyra were standing together, ready to fight for their freedom. It was the turning point, the moment they both realized they weren't trapped anymore. They had found their courage, and they were ready to change the course of their fate. John stood firm, his heart pounding in his chest. The Calta soldiers were just a few steps away now, their heavy boots thudding on the ground as they advanced. The sound was deafening, but John couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Not when freedom was so close. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes sharp and determined. Despite the fear that lingered in the air, there was something in her posture, something fierce and resolute. They weren't just running anymore. They had made their stand. The soldiers stopped in their tracks as they saw John and Lyra, surprised by their defiance. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The soldiers exchanged looks, clearly not expecting to be confronted by two humans, especially not in this way. John stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're leaving. If you want to stop us, you'll have to fight for it." Lyra nodded, her hand tightening on the weapon she had taken from one of the soldiers earlier. She had no idea how to use it properly, but she wasn't afraid to try. They both knew the Calta family's power, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They weren't going to be intimidated anymore. The lead soldier, a tall figure with a cold expression, stepped forward. "You think you can escape," he sneered. "The Calta family owns this planet. You have no chance." John didn't flinch. "You're wrong. We're not your property, and we'll fight for our freedom." Without warning, the soldiers moved in, their weapons raised. John grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her back just in time to avoid a strike. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he realized that there was no going back. This was their fight, and they had to win it. John grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, using it as a weapon. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He swung it at the nearest soldier, knocking him back. The soldier stumbled but quickly regained his balance, charging again. Lyra wasn't far behind. She swung the weapon she had taken, catching another soldier off guard. Her movements were unpracticed, but they were powerful, fueled by desperation and the need to survive. The soldiers seemed surprised by their resistance, but they didn't back down. They were trained fighters, and they would fight until they had their way. But John and Lyra weren't going to let that happen. With every blow they struck, with every move they made, they felt a little stronger. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. They were fighting for a future where they weren't bound by chains, where they could live on their own terms. The battle raged on, the clash of metal, and the sound of grunts filling the air. John fought with everything he had, using every ounce of strength to keep the soldiers back. Lyra fought beside him, her fear fading as she focused on survival. She could feel the weight of the situation, but in that moment, she felt something else. Hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers began to retreat. They had underestimated these two humans, and now they were paying the price. John and Lyra stood together, panting, their bodies bruised and exhausted. But they were victorious. The lead soldier, now on the ground, glared at them. "You may have won today," he spat, "but you'll never escape the Calta family. We'll find you." John wiped the sweat from his brow and stood tall. "Let them try," he said, his voice filled with defiance. "We're free now, and no one is going to take that from us." Lyra looked at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're right," she said. "We're free." Together, they turned and walked toward the ship, their hearts filled with a new sense of purpose. The Calta family might still be out there, but they had proven something today. They had proven that even in the face of unimaginable power, they had the strength to fight for their freedom. And that was just the beginning.